Hello? Yes, I can hear you. Yeah, is my, yes, I agree. Is my voice fine now? Mhm. Is this okay now? Is this okay?
Good morning to you all. We will now begin the second day of the Economics of Informality, an event promoted by the Network of Economic Researchers of Banco de la República, the Central Bank of Colombia, the School of Economics at Universidad del Rosario, and Colombia Científica. We will have translation available for the conference. Please make sure to click on the icon corresponding to your native language. To begin our agenda today, I would like to welcome our keynote speaker, Kostas Megir, who is professor of economics at Yale University. He will speak about the topic, trade and informality in the presence of labor market, friction, and regulations. At the end of this speech, we will have 15 minutes for questions, which you may send in by chat, and will be delivered to the keynote speaker by Carlos Medina, manager of the Medellin branch, Central Bank of Colombia. Mr. Megir and Mr. Medina, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana del Pilar. Thank you, Costas. I'm very honored and happy to introduce today's keynote speaker, Professor Costas Megir. Professor Megir is Douglas A. Warner III Professor of Economics at Yale University and visiting professor at the University College of London. He's associated researcher at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science and the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's also fellow of the British Academy, the Econometric Society, and the Society of Labor Economics. Professor Megir is one of the foreign economy researchers who have made more contributions to the Colombian economic literature in a variety of topics like childcare, conditional cash transfers, and job training programs, among others. So we are very happy to welcome Costas and very honored to have you here. And please, Costas, go ahead and delight us with your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Carlos, and everybody for inviting me to this event. Of course, it would have been fantastic to actually be there physically. I love being in Bogota. As Carlos said, I've worked quite a few years there on a number of issues with people in Colombia, including, of course, Carlos, and it's at the same time, I'm very happy to be giving this talk, and a bit sad that I cannot be there with in the city that I've come to love over the years, and with many friends that are there. But hopefully, better days will come soon, and we'll be able to meet again physically. So. This paper is about how informality interacts with trade. So the title is Trade and Informality in the Presence of Labor Market Frictions and Regulations. And the fundamental question we're going to ask is what is the role of informality when we talk about trade openness, and how do these two features interact. Now, this before we go any further, this paper is jointly authored with Rafael Dix Carneiro from Duke University, Penny Goldberg from Yale University, and Gabriele Ulicea, who is now at UCL. Informality is a major feature of labor markets in developing countries, indeed in many developed countries as well, but perhaps to a lesser extent. So, for example, in Latin America, it varies anything from 35% in Chile to 80% in Peru. Now, of course, the definition of informality is not always totally clear, but basically it reflects an attempt to bypass taxes, regulation, and bureaucratic complications associated with formal firms. Of course, at the same time, it deprives workers of the benefits that are offered by the government, like pensions and sometimes healthcare, or it affects the quality of these services. The broader question, of course, we have is, how does informality affect economic activity? We can think of this in a more general sense, and we can ask, does the presence of a large informal sector, does it somehow help the economy by undermining regulations that are an impediment to investment and growth? Or perhaps is it a mechanism that in some sense reduces growth by misallocating resources to less productive sectors of the economy? For one thing, we understand very well that informal firms are not going to be exporters. So, and we know that an economy a relatively small economy to expand needs export markets. So, so basically, on one hand, we might see informality as an impediment to growth because it allocates resources to less productive firms. On the other hand, it can act as a buffer to help absorb shocks and to mitigate the effects of regulation. So an alternative perspective is that informality causes misallocation of resources, reduces aggregate productivity and welfare, and undermines important regulations that protect workers. And this is evidence, we presented evidence on this kind of perspective in an earlier paper with Renata Narita and Jean-Marc Robin. Now, there has been some work on informality and trade, and basically these papers have shown that shifts out of informality and unemployment are really important adjustments to trade. And this has been shown in papers like McKagan and Pavnik and Dix Carneiro and Kovac. And what Rafael Dix Carneiro and Kovac have shown also is that the presence of large informal sector may have worked as a buffer to trade displaced workers. So basically the idea there is that you open up a country to trade, and then you get competition from foreign companies. So basically you're going to have some inefficient firms or inefficient industries even kind of closing down. Where do these workers go? Well, if there's a large informal sector, it could possibly absorb these workers and kind of act as a cushion to the impact of increased competition from abroad. So, of course, the labor market effects of trade really also depend on how stringent the labor market regulations are. So you can imagine that if you have an economy with very strict regulation, then trade could create a lot of unemployment because basically it's not allowing these workers to reallocate easily to other sectors because of the labor regulations. On the other hand, so if you have a large informal sector, they could absorb these workers. Of course, on the other hand, we have to think of regulations. Some regulations, of course, are always going to be there, right? So you can have health and safety regulations, you can have basic minimum labor standards, and so on. So the question is always relevant. We're never going to have an economy where there's going to be no protections. That would be highly undesirable. So given recent empirical results that study the labor market and welfare effects of globalization, informality, informality and unemployment, and these and regulations are kind of first order question, the way they kind of interact. So trade models that we have seen up to now typically abstract from informality. So, so basically what I've tried to argue here is that we have a lot of factors interacting with each other, right? We have the degree of trade openness, the level of labor market regulations, and indeed the industrial composition and size of the informal sector. So all these things interact, and in order to be able to understand the mechanism that underlie changes that we see following trade openness, we need a model that kind of incorporates all these effects at the same time. Now, of course, to take these things to data, we need a clear definition. So, and when you get into the details, you see that this is not always totally clear. But we're going to call, informal firms are firms that do not register with tax authorities and are invisible to the government. These could be small manufacturing firms, car repair shops, or even small factories, or they could be, of course, unregistered self-employed individuals, or small service companies offering, let's say, tourist services, etc. So these would be informal firms. And then we have informal workers, and these are workers who are not covered by labor regulations. They have no formal contract and basically have received no benefits such as Social Security, and in many countries they are not registered with the healthcare system, or there is a cheaper and more basic healthcare system available to them. And in Brazil, which is going to be our empirical context, they're going to be 48% of workers. There are complications in these definitions that we don't directly address in this company. So, for example, we have formal firms that hire some informal workers, and this has been in Gabriel Ulicea's paper in the AER, but we're not going to deal with these complications in this context. So, what are the potential consequences of informality? The direct consequences. You might have, of course, you've got tax avoidance. Now, that's important because that reduces the ability of the state to provide public goods because it reduces the tax base. You have a misallocation of resources. Now, that's going to be important in an economy with frictions. That means that basically you've got small informal firms that in some sense you could think of it as trapping labor resources that could otherwise be allocated to more productive firms. Informal workers have less job stability, both because they're not covered by regulation, but also because the nature of the firms that hire them are less stable. They have no unemployment insurance, so when they lose their jobs, they have few other sources of income. No employer Social Security contributions to cover their pensions, so when they eventually come to retire, they'll have very low income, and that's going to increase poverty. So these are key issues. But the other side, like in everything, there are these two sides. Informality might provide de facto flexibility to firms and workers to cope with adverse shocks. So what are the kind of specific research questions we will be addressing? We will be talking about the effects of trade in an environment with large informal sector. So we're going to be asking, what are the labor market and welfare effects of trade in an environment with burdensome regulations and imperfect enforcement and monitoring. And how do these effects of trade depend on labor market policies and regulation? How do they depend on enforcement of labor regulation? How do they depend on firing costs, on minimum wages, and on costs of formality? When we say cost of formality, we mean things like payroll taxes and value-added taxes. Now, the answers to these questions really depend on the context in which we operate. So we're going to emphasize the role of search and matching frictions in the labor market. And these are going to play a crucial role for reasons that are going to be hopefully soon understood. So we're going to develop an equilibrium model that builds on the model by Kossar, Gunner, and Thibault in 2016. And this model is a model where the economy is populated by heterogeneous firms. They're heterogeneous in their productivity. And in our model, these firms will be choosing to operate either in the informal sector or the formal sector. So that's going to be part of their decision-making process, and it's going to clearly depend on their productivity, right? And that's going to become apparent. All firms are going to be hiring workers in the same labor market, but this is going to be subject to search and matching frictions, which I'm going to make clear. But the bottom line is that if you want to hire workers, it takes time, and hence it's costly in itself. And there are going to be differences in the ability of formal and informal firms to recruit. There's going to be a government sector, and the government is going to impose minimum wages. It's going to impose firing costs, and it's going to raise taxes through payroll and through import tariffs, payroll and revenue taxes. So this is kind of going to try and describe the actual institutional framework as we have it as it is in Brazil. Now, taxes and labor market regulations, however, are going to be imperfectly enforced. So firms will be able to evade them, and that's when they are informal firms. But that evasion is not going to be costless. There's always going to be a cost of being caught and fined, and basically firms are going to weigh the relative costs of being formal and having to comply with labor market and other regulations vis-a-vis being informal and having to pay a cost of being caught. And this model is going to allow for international trade. So it's going to be a small open economy, and firms are going to export subject to fixed export costs and variable trade costs, like in the work of Melitz. We estimate this model using a variety of sources from Brazil. This is a combination of administrative data, like race, or that covers basically all formal sector firms, and informality surveys that covers firms, the informal firms up to the size of 5, as well as household surveys. So we'll be collecting, so you need the household surveys, of course, because they tell you whether workers are informal or not. And you need the firm level surveys to look at export behavior and revenues and so on. And then we use this model to perform counterfactual simulations to address these questions. So let me give you some kind of idea of how the data looks like. So Brazil has a large informal sector that accounts for about 48% of employment. Transitions from unemployment to informal are much more likely than transitions from unemployment to formal. In other words, an unemployed worker will find an informal job much faster than a formal job. And you can see this at the bottom of the table here with the two highlighted lines in blue. The rate of transition from unemployment to informal employment is about 45%, while from unemployment to formal, it's about half of that. Right? Now, about 6% of workers work in informal tradables, or call them manufacturing if you want, and about twice that in informal tradables. And then about 35% of workers work in informal services, and about 33% in informal services. The big difference, at least in proportions, is between formal and informal tradable sectors that sometimes are going to call manufacturing. Now, informal firms are going to be smaller. So you can see here a very simple regression where we regress the discrete variable informal status on firm size, on the number of workers they employ. And you can see there's a large negative coefficient there, basically saying that larger firms have a much lower probability of being informal. And one of the ways that the model is going to explain this is because as firms become larger, the probability of being caught and consequently the cost of informality is going to increase at an increasing rate. In other words, they're going to be informal, and they're going to be convex costs of informality. So that would mean that there's going to be a much higher probability of becoming formal when the firm grows. So basically, informal firms are going to be small firms with relatively low productivity. Now, by the way, that does not mean that you're not going to have small firms that are going to be formal. There will be small. There's going to be an overlap in the productivity between formal and informal firms, as happens in reality. Now, you also have that wages are larger in larger firms, and they're also larger in formal firms. So you can see from this regression where the left-hand side is the log wage, you can see that the intercepts in the first two columns, which are the formal firms, are much higher, at least in manufacturing, than informal firms, and a bit higher in services firms that are formal relative to services firms that are informal or non-tradables more generally. You also see that there is a premium to working in a large firm, and that premium happens to be higher in the informal sector. But of course, as I said before, the composition of formal sector firms is such that you get more large firms there than in the informal sector. Now, in terms of productivity, right, what you find is that exporters are more productive, and that basically has to happen because to export you have to sink certain fixed costs. So consequently, only more productive firms can become exporters, and larger firms are more productive. So that's kind of as we know it. So I'm mentioning all these facts to give you kind of both an idea of the difference between formal and informal sector, but also to point out the features that the model would have to explain. Finally, you see here that the manufacturing sector, the tradable sector, has the turnover in the tradable sector declines with firm size. So basically, smaller firms have more turnover. That's in part because well, you've got a lot of informal firms that are smaller, and what happens there is that they don't have any firing costs, so they can be more responsive in their employment when they get adverse shocks. On the other hand, exporters have less turnover. Of course, notice that exporters are only in the C sector, which is the tradable sector, which I sometimes refer to as the manufacturing sector. So these are the kind of facts that our model has to be able to explain. And now I'm going to describe the model in a few slides. First of all, we're going to start with consumers. Now, in this economy, there are going to be a whole continuum of goods of different varieties. So it's going to be a monopolistic competition model, which is kind of quite standard in this literature. The consumer enjoys utility by consuming tradables C and non-tradables S. And the tradables are basically an aggregation of all the varieties that consumers buy, and so are non-tradables. So you can think of each firm in the economy as producing one of these little CNs varieties. And then the consumer buys all these varieties, aggregates them, and that provides utility C and respectively S. Each variety is produced by mixing labor L and intermediate goods I. The intermediate goods are extremely important here because they play a key role in transmitting changes in trade openness to the entire economy. So even informal firms are going to be using intermediates, and intermediates are being imported. Some of the intermediates are being imported, and consequently can affect the costs of the informal sector as well. So it kind of creates a link between trade and informality here, which is a direct link, which is quite important. Then productivity itself is random. So that's the source of heterogeneity of firms. And it follows a persistent process. In practice, this is almost like a random walk. So basically, you've got a firm with productivity Z. There are innovations to this productivity, epsilon, and this gets transmitted to the productivity in the next period. And it's these kind of fluctuations there that are responsible for turnover in the economy. And now this is going to play an important role in trade because we're going to show that that firms that engage in larger firms and firms that are engaging in exports are kind of become more sensitive to these shocks. So each of these firms generates revenue, and of course you can think of revenue as being, price times quantity. So if you solve this out in a monopolistic competition context, you get that the revenue depends on the expenditure that goes into tradables and non-tradables. Now, these revenue functions are again linking firms and consumers, because the total amount of revenue is basically coming from the income. It depends on the income that consumers spend on that sector, plus the revenue that comes from intermediate good consumption by firms. So this is this component here, and in services, the revenue that is produced in services, of course, comes from the income of consumers spent there. Again, intermediate good purchase, because intermediate goods are both tradables and non-tradables. And then you've got this other component here, which reflects the various costs that firms have to engage in for entry, hiring, and exporting. So basically, you can think of the cost that the firms are incurring as revenue to firms that are selling non-tradable goods. So of course, all these create linkages across the various sectors in the economy. So, for example, if you reduce entry regulations, you're going to reduce how much is spent in the non-tradable sector. On the one hand, that's going to benefit the firms that need to enter, but it's going to harm the firms that are offering these services. So there are trade-offs everywhere. The other aspect of the economy is are the search frictions. So jobs are not immediately easy to locate. So that means that if a firm wants to expand its labor force from L to L prime, it has to advertise vacancies. And these vacancies generate contacts with workers. Now, in this economy, workers are only searching if they're unemployed. Once they're employed, they don't search for other jobs. So there's no on-the-job search. Now, how many vacancies are posted, and how many workers are looking for work, which means how many unemployed workers we have, is going to generate the number of meetings, the number and matches that occur in the economy. So don't forget we've got four sectors here. We have tradables and non-tradables, C&S, and we have formal and informal. Each set of firms in each of these sectors posts vacancies V. These are the various vacancies. And so we assume they aggregate into one set of vacancies, and these are the number of unemployed workers. So this here is the number of matches that are generated by posting these vacancies. Now, that's going to determine how many matches are going to be created in each sector. And we assume that workers search randomly. They cannot direct their search efforts to any particular sector. They're not going to, they just basically pull jobs randomly, if you wish, without knowing whether a priori these are going to be formal or informal firms or tradable or non-tradable firms. They just search in the labor market randomly, as in Burdett and Mortensen. and so we assume that the matches in each sector are proportional to the relative number of vacancies they post. So, for example, if a sector posts more vacancies, here they're going to be more matches in that sector. Now, because informal firms have more turnover, since they are not subject to firing costs, they are also going to be posting more vacancies. And by posting more vacancies, the number of matches that are going to be created in the informal sector are going to be higher than the number of matches that are created in the formal sector. So that's going to be important, of course, because if a shock creates unemployment, like trade openness, that's going to effectively take workers into the informal sector, because as I showed you also in the data, once you become unemployed, it's easier to find an informal job. So that's going to be a very important mechanism in our model. So the probability of filling a vacancy is going to be the number of matches relative to the number of vacancies in that sector. And it turns out that this is independent of the sector. So you get this this number there. And so the probability of an unemployed worker finding a job in sector K is going to be given by this number here. Now, all this together with the regulations are going to come together into two important features of the model. One is what we call the hiring costs, and the other is the firing costs. So first of all, there are going to be a whole set of hiring costs that are mainly driven from search frictions, and they're going to depend on how much the firm wants to expand. So the more the firm wants to expand, the larger the hiring costs, which is going to prevent firms from adjusting all the way to where they want, because that's going to be increasingly more expensive. On the other hand, there are going to be regulatory firing costs, and these come from, we assume these come purely from legislation. So in order to let workers go, the firms have to pay a cost that might be in terms of severance pay or other regulatory costs. Some of them might be fines towards the government, others might be just severance pay, and they are reflected into this kappa. And the more you want to adjust downwards, the larger the firing costs. So that's going to prevent firms from adjusting much. Okay, and if you think of a large firm there, the ability to go straight down to a much lower size is going to be inhibited by these costs. So this is going to lead to firm profit functions, and it's worth quickly going through them. Profits of a firm are going to depend on the value of a firm. Think of this as the discounted, basically sales after tax. So these are the tax rates, minus the cost of adjusting the labor force minus the fixed cost of operation. Now, what are these costs? And this is the kind of important point here. There are two types of firms here, right? There are formal and informal firms. Formal firms, the costs involve payroll taxes and minimum wages. So firms cannot reduce wages below the minimum if they are formal. And they have to pay payroll taxes. And if they are adjusting upwards, they have to pay hiring costs. This is for expanding firms. Or if they're adjusting downwards, they have to pay regulatory firing costs. Now, the informal firms look very similar. However, they have two cost elements that are distinct. Well, first of all, their costs do not include any firing costs. You see here, there is no firing costs. But they do have their own hiring costs. They may be different, but they take more or less the same form. But the other key feature here are the costs of informality. Think of the cost of informality as being the expected fine that they have to pay. In other words, it's the fine they have to pay if they get caught, which is going to be proportional to revenue, multiplied by some probability of being caught. And this probability is going to depend on their size. So a large informal firm will be very visible to the authorities, very likely to be audited, very likely to pay the fine. So this is going to create a disincentive for firms to grow, for informal firms to grow. So let's see what the timing of the model looks like. There are going to be two figures like this. One is for incumbents, and the other is for entry into the market. So incumbents, if they survive up to this period, are going to be either informal or formal. Informal firms have three possibilities. One is to leave the market, stop producing. That's because they've had a bad productivity shock. So they're no longer profitable. Or they could stay informal. Or they could decide they want to become formal. Why would they decide that? They decide that because they want to grow more. And they've decided that it's, in some sense, cheaper to grow as a formal firm and be subject to the various regulatory costs and taxes, rather than risk paying large fines. Once they make this decision, they're going to choose their labor force, depending on whether they become formal or not. They're going to produce. This is going to generate profits. And then they're going to end the period with a new productivity shock, and the whole process will start again. This is the new productivity shock. In parallel to this process of decisions, there's the process of other firms to start production. So basically, to start to enter the market in either tradables or non-tradables, you're going to have the firms are going to pay a fixed cost, an entry cost, if you like, and by once they pay the entry cost, they see an initial productivity level, and having seen that, they decide whether to become formal, informal, or to just not bother and immediately exit. Once they decide their sector, they choose their labor force, they hire people, and so on. Then they draw a new productivity shock. They become they're incumbents at that point, and so on. So that's how the economy works. Okay, so so how are wages determined? We view wages as determined by firm-worker bargaining. So let's think of there being a union. The union represents the workers, and the union has some kind of surplus. The surplus is basically the wages that people will earn minus the outside option, which is being unemployed, plus the option value of remaining employed and again earning a wage in the next period. Similarly, the firms have a surplus. And what's the surplus of the firm? Well, basically, it is the stream of profits minus the cost that they have to pay to workers and any other costs, right? And so that's the surplus. It's a non-transferable utility type model because the sum of the workers and the firm surplus depends on the wage because of payroll taxes. In other words, the way that the pie is distributed affects the total value of the pie. So basically, workers get a share of this total surplus. In other words, the surplus of the workers is going to be a fraction of the total surplus. So wages are determined by solving this equation. I'm not going to show you the formula, but basically wages are going to be driven by unemployment insurance and by a share of the profits from the firm. Now, informal firms solve the same kind of problem, but of course the nature of the surplus is different because there are no taxes, there's no unemployment insurance, and so on. To this system, we then add an export sector. So basically, only formal manufacturing firms can export. And the calculation is, this is the value of exporting minus a fixed cost that firms have to pay in order to be able to access the foreign market. This fixed cost reflects, if you like, all the marketing that needs to be done, all the research into foreign regulations, and so on. And this net value of exporting is compared to the value of just producing and selling domestically only. Okay, so it's this fixed cost here that is going to that basically drives the fact that exporters are more productive, larger firms than non-exporters, because this has to become large enough to overcome the cost of exporting. Now, a trade is going to be subject to two types of costs. What we call iceberg trade costs. That's a proportional cost that needs to be incurred in order to transport a good from the domestic market to the foreign market. and this includes everything under the sun, anything from the straight transport costs, but it will also include all the regulatory costs that the firm has to incur in order to sell in the foreign market. And then there are going to be tariffs on top of that. So all this thing comes together into an equilibrium. It's a small open economy. So what happens abroad is taken as given by our domestic economy. And in this equilibrium, subject to all these search and regulatory frictions and subject to monopolistic competition, firms act optimally and make entry and exit decisions and post vacancies. There's free entry in the sense that profits are going to be driven to zero. Wages are going to solve the bargaining problem that I described. Subject to all this, labor markets are going to clear, goods markets are going to clear, and we're going to look at the steady state. And in the steady state, there's going to be a distribution of firms, a number of firms, and workers in each sector, and this is going to be stable over time. That defines equilibrium. So basically, because we're not dealing with aggregate shocks here, we have an economy that looks the same in every period, but within it there are a lot of changes because each of these firms are subject to the individual productivity shocks. And then when we're going to do counterfactuals, effectively what we're going to be doing, we're going to be changing some of the parameters of this system and going to be looking at what the new steady state is when we move from one policy environment to another policy environment. It's worth going through some of the mechanisms that drive the results in our model. So let's first of all think of import tariffs. Import tariffs and generally trade costs are going to affect expenditures in each of the sectors. And essentially they affect the demand faced by firms. Because the goods might, if you raise tariffs, then basically, one of the challenges is you make imported intermediate goods more expensive. So that's going to affect worker productivity in all sectors because our firms are going to buy less intermediate goods, and consequently that's going to reduce the productivity of the workers. And this is going to amplify the effect of tariffs. It's going to affect entry, exit, and it's also going to affect whether the firms are going to be formal or not and how big they're going to become. And of course, we know that size affects also export behavior, affects formalization, and so on. Now, suppose you reduce trade costs or tariffs, this will make firms more productive, because that's going to make intermediate goods cheaper. And resources are going to be reallocated to larger and more productive firms that export. And that's going to shift aggregate demand in our economy upwards. And it's going to generate new incentives for productive productive informal firms to grow. And as productive informal firms grow, they want to formalize. So one of the important channels through which a reduction in tariffs can work is basically by increasing productivity and then creating more formal firms, because when you increase productivity, you make it more feasible to export, but exports, of course, require you to be a large firm, and you don't want to be an informal large firm, so you become formal. Against that, of course, is that by making it cheaper to produce, you also attract new, unproductive, informal firms to enter the market. Now, this is a model with frictions. And what does that mean? It means that as workers search for jobs, if they hit upon an informal job, they're going to be captured by that firm, and they're going to be employed there. While if that firm did not exist, perhaps they would search a little bit longer. That's on the negative side, but they might be reallocated to more productive firm, more productive formal firm, and that's on the positive side. This is the typical case that President Johnson was worried about. He said, I want economists with only one hand, because I'm fed up hearing that on the one hand you've got this effect, on the other hand you've got that effect. But that's the reality. And no policy has an effect that doesn't have opposing forces. So ultimately, we do need two-handed economists, but also we need two-handed empirical economists to be able to quantify the various trade-offs and be able to give an idea as to where how the trade-offs actually play out in real life. The other mechanism in this model works through unemployment. So if you have a reduction in tariffs, you basically have more competition from abroad. This can generate unemployment because inefficient firms are suffering competition for goods that are close substitute to them, will kind of close down or will shed workers. That's going to create more unemployment. More unemployment is immediately going to imply more informality, because it's going to be faster to find an informal job from unemployment than a formal job. The other mechanism is this sensitivity effect, where export value added is a magnified version of non-exporters. So if you think of this being the value added, if you think of this as being the value added of non-exporters, then the exporters' value added is kind of amplified by this expression here, and this is the foreign demand shifter. So what does this mean? Since this component here depends on the productivity shock, let's suppose the productivity shock generates some volatility in the value added of domestic producers, then the value added of exporters is larger. The volatility in the value added of exporters is larger. So that means that for exporters, the hiring and firing decisions are more sensitive to productivity shocks. And so reducing trade costs will reallocate, on the one hand, will reallocate resources to larger and more stable firms, but increase in export activity, so to larger firms like this, but then increasing in export activity will then go the other way and increase the sensitivity to productivity shocks, which will increase turnover. So if the net effect is more turnover, then search costs will imply more unemployment and hence more informality. So increased openness can actually increase unemployment and informality through these various mechanisms. But it doesn't have to. And ultimately, what it does is that it's an empirical question, which we are trying to answer here. I will not take you through the details of the estimation strategy, but I will just say a couple of things. There are certain parameters that we take from earlier studies, things like iceberg costs. Once we've set these parameters, then we're left with 27 parameters in all these systems that I showed you that we fit by comparing 84 data moments to those of the model. It's done by indirect inference. Basically, we compare regression coefficients that are estimated on the real data relative to regression coefficients that are estimated using simulated data. So that's called indirect inference. It's a subcase of the method of moments estimation procedure. Simulated method of moments. Why simulated? Because the way you generate data from the model. In order to generate data from the model, you have to simulate the model because you don't have analytical closed form solutions. So, having said that, and of course there will be soon a paper to be circulated where all the details of estimation and the model fit will be presented. What I can tell you now is that the model fit is really great. So the model is able to reproduce all these features that I showed you initially. So it does represent the reality we observe in a very clear way. So I don't have to show you this at this point, but it will all be in the paper. What I can do now is I can use this model to run some counterfactual experiments that relate to the various issues that we talked about. So we're going to do 3 types of counterfactuals. The first, we're going to play around with policy relating to the enforcement of regulations. In other words, policy that's trying to target informality. The second set of counterfactuals will relate to trade policy. In other words, we're going to ask what happens as we vary tariffs. And the third set of policies is going to relate to changing taxation within our economy. So I've highlighted some blue bits here because I think they are the first things to focus. So what we do in this table, we show 4 different scenarios. The first column is the benchmark economy. In other words, the economy to which we fitted the data. The next 2 columns make informality costs more convex. In other words, we increase the rate at which firms are visible as they become larger. So if you think, if you think that this is the size of the firm, and this is the probability of being caught, or if you like, the fine, then if in the benchmark economy this looks like this, in the simulated economy we make this kind of more convex, like this. So that means that for any specific size, the cost of informality increases, but it increases more for large firms. And we have two experiments. One is convex 1 and the other is convex 2. Convex 1, the change is less dramatic than in convex 2. And finally, in the last column, we basically impose extreme policies such that there's no informality. Just as a small aside, when we increase the fines of informality, the revenue flows back to the government as a revenue itself. So what do you see? You see that if you increase the cost of informality a little bit, you actually get a reduction in unemployment. Effectively, this is basically a reallocation of resources. What's going on? You're reallocating resources to more productive firms, right? They are more stable. So because they are more stable, they are shedding fewer workers. And you can see this in the second panel, the middle line. You can see that the aggregate productivity of the manufacturing sector has gone up by about 6%. The share of informal employment, of course, goes down, which is the same direction. Income per capita, however, goes down. This is the reason for that is that by making informality a little bit more costly, you're shutting down some variety of goods, and this affects welfare effectively. Now, if you abolish, if you increase costs too much, then you kind of start losing the effect because there's a trade-off, right? The informality basically absorbs workers. So if you restrict it too much, you start generating unemployment. And in the extreme, you can see that when you abolish informality, you get much more unemployment. So there's a kind of a happy medium here where you want to reduce informality, but actually going all the way without changing other regulations, you might end up increasing unemployment. Now, this is what I hinted at before, that what's the effect of policies that reduce informality interact with the regulations. So, for example, suppose you take the Brazilian economy as it is now and you abolish informality completely, then you are going to increase unemployment from 18%, which is in the benchmark economy, to 33%. However, this is in part because of very high minimum wages. So if you reduce minimum wages, this unemployment effect is going to be mitigated. Indeed, look at what's going on here. In the formal sector, in the benchmark economy, the current minimum wage only bites for 4% of workers, effectively because the formal firms are so productive, they're paying higher wages through this bargaining scheme that we discussed. But if you abolish informality, you have a composition effect, and you've got much less productive formal firms coming in, because all firms have to be informal, and for half of them, the minimum wage is biting, which of course reduces employment. But if you reduce the minimum wage, you only get an impact on 38% of firms. Income per capita and welfare actually declines when you abolish informality completely. This reflects again the previous table where I said, an intermediate policy would be welfare improving, but not an extreme policy. And you can see, of course, that that's in part a function of other labor market policies like the minimum wage. So, for example, if you reduce minimum wages, the welfare effects of abolishing informality will be mitigated. But of course, we know that you don't want to abolish minimum wages completely. We know that in an economy with frictions, minimum wages will ensure that workers are that firms are not exercising monopolistic power. So that's why the policy mix here is a relatively difficult question, right? And extreme policies can have very negative effects. So, okay, so for example, no, actually, let me skip this. Now let's go to import tariffs because we just have 5 minutes left. So import tariffs, on the horizontal axis, we're showing the import tariffs. And on the vertical axis in this graph, we're showing real income per capita relative to the benchmark. So each of the lines represents an alternative policy regime. The benchmark regime is the blue line. And what this shows is, at least in this model, welfare is maximized at a tariff of about 50%, which is not far off what we have now. Now, if you had no informality, then increasing tariffs actually reduces income very, very fast. But with some informality, to absorb the to mitigate the effects of trade, of closing up trade, basically this effect is much weaker. So you still have a decline in income as you increase tariffs beyond that peak, but that decline in income is lower in the presence of informality. It also shows. Okay, so let me go on to the next one here. Of course, what's going on here underneath the hood, if you like, is that as you are increasing tariffs, you're of course increasing the size of the informal sector. Right. So as you're closing the economy to foreign trade, you're basically shifting the economy towards the informal sector, basically because becoming formal is less profitable now because you don't have the export option as much as you had it otherwise. So less firms formalize, and this is the result. And a lot of this effect is because you have an increase in the share of workers working in the informal tradable sector. So basically, you've got a lot of informal firms. Basically, you end up having more firms in the informal tradable sector when you're increasing tariffs. Now, what happens to unemployment in the various scenario? So basically, once you increase tariffs in the benchmark economy, once you increase tariffs beyond 50%, you start having higher and higher unemployment. And this effect is much larger if you have no informality. Because basically firms find it too expensive to operate, so they basically close down in that economy while in the economies with some informality, they become informal, which of course reduces their costs. Now let's finally go to the payroll tax. The payroll tax is about 37.5% in the benchmark economy. If you increase payroll tax, you get, now this is quite straightforward, you just get an increase in informality. Okay, so that's straightforward, there's no ambiguity there, no turning points, nothing. The higher the payroll tax, the more informal employment you get. But interestingly, you're getting less unemployment. Why? Well, basically, you get entry of more informal firms, right? They hire faster, so that reduces unemployment, but it reduces unemployment towards the informal sector with all the other effects that this has. And payroll income per capita, now that's a more complicated figure. Basically, if you increase payroll tax beyond what we have now, there's going to be a decline in payroll income per capita, but actually that's going to be true also if you decrease it. And that's a complicated interaction between what happens in between tradables and non-tradables, formal and informal firms. By the way, interestingly, if you increase payroll taxes, you're going to actually decrease government revenue. And that's because of the increased role of informal firms, and thus you get a reduction in the tax base. All these policies, of course, are partial. We tried to show before that, for example, the way that the economy reacts to tariffs is going to depend on your policies on informality. So, in order to look at policy, in a more informed way, one would have to look at combinations of policy, like what happens if we say reduce payroll tax, but at the same time we increase informality enforcement. Of course, you can do all that with a model. It becomes quite complex to characterize. But the important lesson here is that in a world like this, where you've got surge frictions, you've got an export sector, you've got informality and regulations, all these policies interact and sometimes give you counterintuitive effects. So just to conclude, reducing informality can increase productivity, but can reduce income per capita. And small reduction in informality can reduce unemployment. The effects of eliminating informality depend on other regulations, such as the minimum wage. And eliminating informality can increase unemployment. Increasing minimum wages will increase unemployment and informal employment. And finally, increases in tariffs beyond about 50% reduces welfare, increases informality, mainly in manufacturing, tradable sector, increases unemployment. And all these effects are magnified if informality is eliminated. Trade liberalization, growth, and lax labor market policies cannot themselves correct misallocation given by imperfect enforcement of regulations. And it's much better if government enforced formal status in a better and more coherent way. This is what I have to say. And again, thank you very much for coming to this session and for inviting me to this conference.
Great, Kostas. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting presentation. Very, very interesting and insightful model. So we are going to get some questions from the people who are here with us. So first, let me share you one, which says, it seems to me that when you refer to labor informality, it is more about salaried informality than to self-employment. Self-employment will have almost zero search costs and transits more to inactivity than to unemployment. Do you see that there is room to adapt your model to self-employment that covers most of the informality problem in Colombia?
Well, first of all, let me say that in this model, we include the self-employed as firms of size 1. Secondly, yes, in a more complex model, you could perhaps treat them in a different way, but they still face surge costs, because if they want to expand, and suppose you start a little business as a self-employed plumber, then you still have to hire people, so you will be subject to surge costs. So it's not totally clear to me that that the model as it is doesn't capture the main features that we are interested in. In some sense, the huge prevalence of self-employment is a result of the various institutional features that prevent firms from growing.
Okay, perfect. So there is other question here. Why does a reduction of tariffs in the models increases exports? Is this a bilateral reduction of tariffs that directly opens external markets? That is basically, is the experiment about FTA rather than unilateral tariff reduction?
This is, well, one of the effects, it's not bilateral, but that's where intermediate goods play an important role. A reduction in tariffs reduces the cost of production by reducing the cost of intermediaries. That increases firm productivity, firms grow, and then they become large enough and productive enough to want themselves to export.
Okay, perfect. So, I mean, Costas, it seems to me that the Brazil economy, when you look at the benchmark, seems pretty close to the ideal scenario, doesn't it? Like according to your counterfactual exercises. What's your take on that? I mean, is that the case? Isn't there that much room for it to improve?
Well, I think that's where the combination. We were, of course, surprised as well by this, and we've looked at it very carefully. Of course, these are. It looks ideal or optimal if you look in one dimension. It's not clear that there is no combination of policies that would improve welfare. So because these policies interact, so you saw, for example, in some of the graphs that when we change the minimum wage, the various peaks of the graphs shifted position. So there might be a much better policy mix where some of the labor market regulations are reformed together with the openness of the economy. In other words, you might think of say a payroll tax being optimal given the degree of openness, or given the level of minimum wages, or given the level of firing costs. I'm sure it's not going to be optimal once we start talking about changing some of the other regulations like firing costs and minimum wages.
Okay, great. There is another question by the public regarding your self-employed firm size 1. Have you thought about allowing these owners to have the option to shut down the business, not because profits are negative, but instead because a wage job provides higher earnings?
No, because there's no on-the-job search here. But there is a rate at which these self-employed people close down because of productivity shocks, and consequently you're going to have if that happens, you're going to have a steady reallocation to larger firms.
Okay, there is something I would like to ask you about. Something actually Penny Goldberg pointed out that very much when she was chief economist of the World Bank, which is that theoretically one can always redistribute from winners to losers, from firms winning to losing, to those losing because of trade. But in the practice, that's not the case. Have you thought of? I mean, in your model, you can see what's the government doing with the revenues. So have you thought of changing the model so that you could, to some extent, account for that?
I mean, that's a very good question. The problem is that our model is not extremely well suited for this, simply because, first of all, it doesn't have worker heterogeneity, so you can't think of targeting, say, low-skilled versus high-skilled workers. Secondly, of course, it doesn't have a regional dimension. So, a lot of the action in Brazil, for example, with trade openness, was winners in one region vis-a-vis winners in another region. And the question is, some of the losers are going to be people who become unemployed, and some of the losers are going to be people who become informal. The question is how well you can target these people without creating even more disincentives. Of course, the formal sector has the minimum wage. So I think this is an extremely important question, but I don't think it's very easy to address within this model.
Right. I mean, the model is already great and really complex, and this other thing I thought while seeing your model was about unemployment insurance. So there is an issue of how much people who lose their job can wait for getting another one, and that affects like the livelihood very much of waiting for an employment in the formal sector rather than in the informal one. And well, I mean, that might be much easier to maybe include and assess. What do you think about that? Or
well, what's interesting in these models is that people actually, in order to get the kind of rates of employment you get, people actually have to have a disutility of unemployment. So they will basically get the first job that they find. Now, if you raised enough unemployment insurance, then you'd basically be shutting down the informal sector, right? Because they will not be able to hire workers because they'll be waiting around for informal workers. So that could be an indirect mechanism for enforcement. I'm not sure it's going to be the most efficient one.
Okay, Costas, thank you so much. It was a very, very interesting and illuminating talk. So I want to thank you on behalf of all the organizers, on all the people who are with us today. And I mean, we're so happy to have had you here. Now I'm going to pass the word to Adriana del Pilar. And thank you so much again, Costas.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and everybody for organizing this.
Mr. Maguire and Mr. Medina, thank you so much. And now we will have a 30 minutes break, and you will meet at 11 o'clock for the second contributed session. This section will present different academic papers especially select for their rigorousness and quality through which informality will be studied from various perspectives. To access the session, please go to the scheduled post on the website of this conference. In the agenda, click in the contributed session number 2, then select the contributed session of your interest, and finally, there you will find the link at the key to access the session.